Marketers, you know that feeling when your content just works? When you crush a viral trend before 10 a.m.? When one tiny tweak to a landing page sends click-through rates through the roof? That's Contentful. Dynamic content made blissfully simple. Contentful helps you create and launch personalized experiences instantly across any digital channel. No stress, no limits, only possibilities. Come get the feels at Contentful.com.
Choice Hotels get you more for your money so you can maximize any road trip. Like with the road trippers we see here in their natural habitat, the breakfast area at a Comfort Inn. Here's a dad teaching his son how to make waffles, fluffy golden waffles. There's a mom making sure her daughter eats some fruit to avoid the "I'm hungry" from the back seat. And a sibling standoff over the last muffin. This is the cycle of vacation maximizationing in all its glory. Check into more. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
Hello and welcome to episode 234 of Something About the Beatles, with a lot more coming and more shows on the agenda to be taped. Lots of stuff coming. This has really been a year heating up with so much to talk about. Yes, we talk about Get Back a lot, but there's a lot to talk about, and you cannot contain it all in a handful of shows. So, this show is no different in that respect, in that we do touch on it a bit, but other things as well, because here we are now, Paul McCartney at 80. He's finally the third Beatle to reach that birth anniversary. Wish John was here for his, but at least we still have Ringo. And Ringo had that pretty terrific TV party on his 80th 2 years ago, the height of COVID. Paul is just coming off the road now. It's ending, I think, at his 80th birthday. So it's just amazing that we have him here. He's still out there delivering with the energy of somebody a fraction of his age. And I hope a lot of you guys got to see it. It's something that we will be exploring a bit. In fact, I will tell you now that I had one listener approach me with a really cool story, this encounter with Paul. And you will see that on our YouTube channel pretty soon. But I would welcome anybody. Now, Ringo's kind of on ice because COVID has hit his tour. But if anybody's got a encounter stories, don't have to be this year, it can be whatever, and you have some visual accompaniment and you want to tell your story and it's something cool, then reach out to me, because I'm going to start collecting these things and putting them up on the YouTube channel, because there's so many cool stories out there. When I've done public events, people have told me things, and I just get correspondence about this stuff. So I think, you know what, we should just collect these and just stick them in one place. And so we will be doing that pretty soon. But anyway, Paul McCartney at 80. Before we get into this show, I would like to talk about the next show, somebody else turning 80, 2 days after Paul. Maybe you can guess who that is. But somebody who is a kindred spirit, who has a lot of commonality with Paul. I don't think I'll tip my hand just yet, but some of you will be able to figure it out. Anyway, that will be the subject of the next show. The guest I'm having for that is returning guest Glenn Greenberg, who you know from the first show we did together was the Dear Friend show, examining the friendship of John and Paul during the 70s. And he also came back last autumn for the show we did speculating about post-1970 Beatle albums. So you guys might remember those shows. He's a great guy, super writer. He originally came from the Marvel universe, but he's done a lot of Beatle writing. In 2020, he did a John Lennon 80th anniversary bookazine, maga book, whatever you want to describe them as, one of those newsstand commemorative things. And he's got another one that's just out now, a special edition Time bookazine, Paul McCartney at 80, Yesterday, Today, and Beyond. The thing about these things, completists will want to get it, but people that aren't going to plow through one of these big, thick books that get produced, this is for you, because it is so completely rich with visuals as well as text written by a guy that knows the subject deeply. And I always liken it to people who I've known who have written for baseball cards or sports cards, and you've got a head full of all this great information and you have to distill it down to fit the parameters of the template. And in this case, I don't know how many pages it is, I haven't counted them, but obviously you could fill volumes on Paul's story, beginning with childhood in Liverpool on through the Beatle years and then the 50 plus years we've had past that. And he's still actively working. It's not like he's resting on his laurels. So every year there's something new to write about. And Glenn has had to take all that information and try to distill it down to go alongside these great visuals. And it's a challenge. But know then that what you're getting is pretty solid stuff from somebody who knows his subject. Is basically a highlights reel of Paul's life in print form. But the great thing about Glenn is that it gives us room for the stuff that got bumped from this to have him back on the show, which we're already planning for the one beyond the next show. So you got that to look forward to. Meanwhile, for Mr. McCartney at 80, I want to do something special, and it seems like a thing in obvious plain sight that got kind of smothered, buried, if you will, by the Get Back docuseries, and that is the 2-volume slipcase book that came out last year, Paul McCartney, The Lyrics. I didn't see it really get its due the way it probably should have, but it's been on the back burner in my head as something to get a discussion going on the show to talk about, because it is a very rich, deep thing, and it's something that is absolutely worthy of every fan's attention. It could have been a separate picture book, because there's so many great pictures in there, a lot of which, as hardcore as you may be in Beatles, I guarantee you haven't seen before. I mean, he's really going to the vault for this. As well as these great recollections drawn out of him by Paul Muldoon, an Irish poet, who sat with him over the course of 25 hours and just basically did kind of like a more expansive version of what David Sheff did with John in 1980 for the Playboy interview, where he just starts reading the list of songs to him and gets him to spark whatever memories came into the writing of that song, recording of it, or whatever else may have come out at that moment. This was something that was really a brilliant approach. It is not without things that you can be picky about, for sure. But if you look at it as sort of a companion volume to Many Years From Now, as well as maybe the McCartney 321 docuseries, which we also talk a little bit about in this episode, and Wingspan and Anthology, and any other instances where Paul is getting his side of the story out. So he's putting this on record. Short of actually penning a memoir himself, this may be the closest you get. We thought that with Many Years From Now, which was produced with Barry Miles. But here's another one, and it's even deeper and richer, if you can imagine that. So I wanted to get somebody on the show that had a pretty good perspective on Beatle literature to begin with, but also Beatle fandom, knows the lore, is more than someone that's a casual fan, and happens also to be a bibliophile, a guy that not only collects Beatles, but also collects books, very well read, and has in fact written a number of reviews. I'm not talking about Amazon reviews, I'm talking about for print publication. And that was how I met Terry Zobek, who is our guest today. He's a first-generation Beatle fan, and this was something that caught my attention in the Doug Sulpy newsletter that he puts out, I think quarterly, but I'm not 100% sure. That's something else I want to talk a little bit about. Doug Sulpy, of course, it was the primary author, or the name most people know, connected with Drugs, Divorce, and a Slipping Image, co-written with Ray Schweighardt, republished as Get Back as a mainstream publication book at some point. Subsequent to that, he's revised it since as Drug, Divorce, and a Slipping Image. I don't think it exists in print per se, but you can get from his website the updated PDF of it. And as noted on the Peter Jackson show, he used it as a roadmap when he was putting together Get Back, because there is nothing else out there as thorough and deep and knowing as Doug Sulpy's work on the Get Back project. And in fact, he's now, I think, 2 installments deep into his critique of the Get Back docuseries, which we talk a little bit about. But his website, DougSulpy.com, DougSulpy.com, has all of his publications there, several books, as well as in the regular newsletter, these deep, deep examinations of the Dutch imports, if you will, that are in circulation, new stuff coming out, lots of video stuff. He's got a few books published on that. And he is the source. I've never seen deeper research on the ins and outs of this stuff than the stuff that Doug does. The 910, That is his newsletter, and that's the platform he's been getting this stuff out on. You can find all that stuff at DougSulpy.com. I highly suggest, if you are at all a serious hardcore Beatle fan, that too much is not enough, check out his stuff. And that's how I found Terry. And this will be the first of at least 2 proposed shows that I'm doing with Terry, because in addition to his Beatle fandom and knowledge of that history, professionally, he's retired now, but professionally, he comes from a background of working with drugs, not as a vendor or user, but an expert on the subject and drug addiction, which I thought is a very welcome expertise to bring to the table when discussing Beatle history. So you've got that to look forward to. In any event, I had him give a thumbnail background of him, so since he is new to the show, and most people have probably not read his reviews for the Doug Sulpy newsletters. So you'll hear that at the onset. So, Terry, why don't you give a little bit of your background? Because I think it would be useful for people to know that you've been steeped in the Beatles story basically from the beginning.
Right. February 9th, 1964, it is a real demarcation point in my life. I was fortunate that our mother loved music, particularly jazz, and she was always watching Ed Sullivan. And I was 10 years old at that time, so I really wasn't paying attention to that kind of stuff. I'd watch it, and I couldn't stand Topo Gigio, but I thought the plate spinners were interesting.
Were you much of a music fan to that point?
Well, I was aware of stuff, and Mom would play. She was a big Sarah Vaughan and Dinah Washington, Errol Gardner, Bix Beiderbecke, Billie Holiday, and Frank Sinatra, till he had to split with the Kennedys. Then we never heard Sinatra in the house again. At least not when she played him. I'm still a Sinatra fan. So the music was there, and I remember hearing the pop stuff on the local radio stations. And we'd be watching Ed Sullivan, but nothing stuck in our mind. But then we started hearing about the Beatles. I'd seen that Jack Parr episode in December. They began to play I Want to Hold Your Hand. And so the excitement, the interest was building, so that when February 9th came around, we were all excited. My brother and I, my sister was less than a year old, so she doesn't remember, but she certainly was educated by my brother and I over the years, so she's a huge Beatles fan too now, and has been. So I still remember sitting in front of that black and white television, watching that, and remembering when they put the subtitles of their names and John, sorry girls, he's married, crap, and all that. But the music was exciting. It was like, wow, this is different.
Was that your first visual glimpse of them?
Yeah, they look so cool. And to this day, John's my favorite, and I love the way he'd stand at the microphone with his feet apart, slightly bent at the knees, and playing that rhythm guitar. But everything about them was just neat. I remember going to school the next few days, and everybody was talking about it. And you began to see the Brill cream disappearing from people's hair and letting it grow and being combed down over their forehead, and the people coming in with Cuban heel boots and stuff. I mean, it was tremendous. And it wasn't until about 65 or 66 that my brother Matt and I started buying records. And that's never stopped. I've got a whole closet full of the vinyl back here behind me of all our singles. And never got rid of any of that. And so we really started buying all that. And then my taste began to broaden with other people. It took me several years to become a fan of the Stones, but love them now. So anyhow, we became big music fans and watched Sullivan all the time and all the other shows, that Shindig and Hullabaloo and Hollywood Palace. Remember seeing the Stones on there when Dean Martin made his asshole introduction to it.
Rolling Stones, aren't they great? They're going to leave right after the show for London. They're challenging the Beatles to a hair pulling contest, I think. I could swear Jackie Coogan and Skippy were in that group. Well, I'm going to let you in on something. You know all these singing groups today, you're under the impression they have long hair. Not true at all. It's an optical illusion. They just have low foreheads and high eyebrows. So, as we leave you, right now, we'll have a short intermission, and we'll be back in Hollywood Palace in about a minute. Now, don't go away. You wouldn't leave me here alone with the Rolling Stones, would you?
I didn't start going to concerts until about 1970. I think my first concert I ever went to was Blood, Sweat, and Tears at Public Hall. And then I saw Paul for the first time in 76 on the Wings Over America tour. And I had tickets for George's show in Cleveland, but the blizzard came through and they got stuck in Chicago. But they didn't cancel the show until my friend Carl and I were driving out the venue, Richfield Coliseum, and they came on and said that the show's been canceled. We had to turn around and go home. So that was a big disappointment. I never got to see George. And then I did go on his first two All-Star tour, those shows here in Washington, D.C. area.
Now we've gotten to know Terry a bit. Here is our discussion of the lyrics, starting out with just the sheer physicality of the thing.
Like you say, just by the format itself, it's the kind of book you can just dip into and bounce around and stuff. I paid a lot of attention to Paul's foreword and then Muldoon's introduction, and then I started going through it. I'd taken about 6 pages of notes, so there was quite a bit of other interesting information.
Yeah, so I guess how people take this as fans, a lot of it will be predicated on what their expectations are and what it should be, and therefore whether it hits the mark or not. When it came out, when I first saw the pre-press in advance of the publication, I personally got a sense that he was doing maybe sort of an I Me Mine type of book, showing the manuscripts of the handwritten lyrics and maybe commenting on them. I had no real sense of how sprawling and in-depth it would be. So with my expectations kind of on the low side, and also recognizing, well, maybe he feels he's told his story adequately already, and many years from now, there'd be no need to go into any kind of real depth with this. And then once it came out, it's 2 volumes and filled with all kinds of pictures that we as Beatle people have never seen before from the private archives. And these lengthy tellings prompted by Muldoon of individual songs, and how a memory of something could be triggered that might have great meaning for him, but not be apparent to the person listening to and enjoying the song. That was the real richness for me. The term he uses is kaleidoscope, which I think is a good way of summing it up.
Yeah, I had the same impression. I went into this thinking, well, let's see how detailed Paul will be. And he's told some of the stories over and over again. If I hear about scrambled eggs one more time, I'm going to vomit.
Right. Or Blackbird.
Yeah, or Blackbird, or Hey Jude. There's so many different ones. But what I thought was interesting when I got into it is I realized, for one thing, it was a great choice using Muldoon, a poet, someone who Paul could talk to about the creative process. But I was reminded, did you ever see the Holocaust documentary Shoah?
Oh, yeah.
It was that kind of a technique. And you kind of referred to the idea of bringing up memories you may not have really thought about when an interviewer asks kind of specific questions that aren't directly related. I remember, particularly from Shoah, the interviewer was asking survivors, what was the weather like the day you arrived at the camp and got off the boxcar? Or what were you wearing that day? Things that are kind of irrelevant to the horrible story, but they triggered those memories that they hadn't thought about or not told people before. And there was a bit of that, I thought, with these conversations. Muldoon mentions right up front that they taped all these conversations and then they were transcribed by the MPL people. And then his job was to go through them and make a seamless story kind of thing out of it. I kept that in mind as I was reading these things, because some of them, he starts off talking about the song, then he goes off on another tangent kind of thing. And you have to read the whole thing to get the whole picture, the flow of things. And there's so much in it about how Paul writes and his estimate of his own style and things like that. That's what I found really interesting. For example, he talks about the influence of his parents and his family and just the mundane aspect of things. And he says, I like the mundane. And he uses Another Day as an example. It's an observation of Linda going through a day kind of thing and just picking up these mundane things. Eleanor Rigby, he likes to listen to people. He talks about how he's at an event or something party. He kind of likes to fade into the background as much as Paul McCartney can and listen to people. And my other passion is books, and I collect books, and I've gone to a lot of author events. And so many of them say that one of the keys to writing is listening. Paul mentions that too. I thought that was really interesting. So many things that he overhears makes its way into his songs, either a magic conversation or even just a word. He talks about Spin It On, and he mentions that Linda referred to tadpoles as salamanders. And he says, that's a great word. I got to pop that into a song. And he sticks it in there and he acknowledges it makes no sense.
Right. Getting closer.
Getting closer, right. And that's one of the knocks you read about Paul quite often, is that as a lyricist, he often doesn't make any sense at all. And he's kind of deliberate on his part. Sometimes it's an obscure reference, like dustbin lid is the one that people really like. What the hell? Then he even mentions, well, it's rhyming slang for kid. And I say, oh, okay. But in other cases, he just likes the word or the phrase and stuff, and he throws it in there. That's something that I've often thought about with a lot of songwriters, that sometimes it's not the lyrics having to tell a story and make sense as much as it is the images they may be creating or the sound that they're going for. One of my other favorite songwriters is Bob Dylan, and he does that constantly. Something like Visions of Johanna. One of my favorite lines in that is the ghost of electricity howls through the bones of her face. Now that kind of doesn't make a hell of a lot of logical sense, but it's a great image. And he's got millions of those, and Paul does as well. And then he also says, sometimes I'm just going for the sound of something. And he mentions Old Siam, Sir. He says, the lyrics, they're probably third in the list of priorities for that song. First of all, it's the aggressiveness of the music, and then his vocal attack, the voice that he wants to use, and then the lyrics. He says, I'm embarrassed by the lyrics because they don't make any sense at all. But that's one of my favorite songs on one of, I think, his most underrated albums, Back to the Egg.
Yeah, it is interesting because I think that a lot of rock journalists writing about Paul, writing about Wings, will move in on the attack for what they perceive as the banality a lot of times of what he writes about or the way he expresses it. Maybe they think he's being hackneyed or just not trying. John himself would say this about Paul, that he was a good lyricist when he tried and when he wasn't, that he didn't believe he was a good lyricist, therefore he didn't try. And I think the thing that Paul must have glommed onto, and he didn't really take the time to defend himself or articulate a defense of himself much until recent years, is that he wasn't trying to write lyrics that stood independent of the music like poetry. And there's plenty of people that look at rock lyrics as poetry, and that's not a direction you should go to. If a rock set of lyrics stands as a good poem on its own, then it's by accident, because it was not created to stand alone. It was created to be part of not only the melody that it's wedded to, but also the overall performance and sound. And certainly the Beatles, with the palette that they utilized in terms of production and instrumentation, everything that they learned from George Martin and then expanded upon, it's the overall picture that is the final intent, and not any element that you remove from it and expect to stand on its own. In John's way of writing, where especially once he moved past the wordplay of his earlier years, where we're sort of incorporating touches of his in his own right and standard and work stuff into lyrics, just going for the sound of things. Paul was doing that too, without the credit in a lot of his things, but wedded to the music. They sounded amazing. Talking about My Salamander and Getting Closer, it's a great lick that sonically is great and flows off the tongue. Doesn't have a whole lot of literal meaning, and it shouldn't. I always think about the picture sleeve in England to that single of the man walking the lobster down the sidewalk, which again, great visual, makes you want to buy the record, but has nothing to do with anything. So deconstructing things like that a lot of times will make them seem kind of stupid, pointless, lazy, whatever. And that's not really the way it should be graded. And I think that the lyrics book goes a long way to people that are receptive to that sort of thinking about these songs. Look at the overall package. Don't separate things, because then you will lose the magic. It's the way the overall performance and recording makes you feel that you should be grading the stuff on.
Exactly. And I make the point right off the bat in my review in the 910 that lyrics aren't poetry. You just can't divorce them from the music. And I've often said, in talking to friends about the Beatles and things, is that What people sometimes don't recognize is they made damn good recordings. Some of their lyrics aren't that involved. I mean, take something like I Want to Be Your Man, basically one verse and a chorus. And I've always thought that I have not really appreciated too many Beatles covers. And I think it's because the other acts that cover them just don't have the voices of Lennon and McCartney, and they don't have a great arrangement or just the actual recording. Now, an exception would be what the Stones did with I Want to Be Your Man. They really rocked that up, and the guitars of Brian Jones and Keith Richards are just fantastic on that. But really, you just can't divorce those lyrics from the arrangement and the recording itself. And lyrics has a number of songs in there where the lyrics just aren't all that high. I mean, Love Me Do, nobody's going to ever claim that that's a great lyric, and a few others. But something that you just mentioned a bit ago, I see this book as Paul's attempt at this stage in his life to kind of get that credit for his songwriting, and not just the Beatles years. I mean, I like the fact that quite a bit of this book is taken up with his Wings and solo career stuff, because I do believe he's written some really fine songs that in the years to come are going to get recognized as the equals of the Beatles songs, at least in terms of the writing. And as I mentioned in the review, he's got this handicap. He's never going to be able to overcome the fact that the Beatles were so damn popular and created such an astonishing body of work in just under 7 years. And then here he is in the last 30 years or so. Very few people say, oh, that work is as good as, but there's some really terrific songwriting he's done on his own or with other collaborators.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's unfortunate for him that the ground is so shifted in the way that we look at and listen to music, distinct from the Beatles days, where what they were doing was so new and extraordinary and reshaping everything you thought about music compared to what came before it, and how everything sort of followed that lead. He didn't have that kind of power post-Beatles to rewrite the narrative that everybody started following him. There was way too much competition. Audiences had matured and changed. So as extraordinary as individual pieces of work might be that came post-Beatles, they're not going to get the same kind of spotlight. And I could see him wanting to use this, pointing in that direction. Hey, guys, I'm glad you like that stuff I did during those first 7 years, but here's some other amazing stuff, too, that you may like if you give it a second listen, and don't try to put it on the same level as what the Beatles made you feel, because it's not that, which doesn't make it unworthy.
Right. I mean, the Beatles were blazing a trail there. They were building on what came before them, but I've often thought and talked to people that if you were someone who knew nothing about rock and roll during the 60s and stuff, but if you had some appreciation of music, if you were to place the Beatles albums in front of them, ask them to listen to them several times, get used to them, they could probably put them in the correct chronological order because of the advancements in the songwritings and the arrangements and the musicians and stuff. Nobody would say Sgt. Pepper's their first album. It just was this progression. They were getting better and better and better. And by the time Paul's on his own, all that kind of stuff had become the norm. And it wasn't as though he could develop things much further. Plus, he was confined in his style and stuff. He's not going to invent glam rock, grunge, and stuff like that. That just wasn't his forte. But he did write a tremendous amount of really good songs. Band on the Run, Jet, these are as good as many of his Beatles compositions, I think. They would have made Beatles recordings if they were still around.
I know it's a highly subjective thing, but again, it comes down to these records were successful commercially. A lot of the taint on them may be the residual critical disdain in the wake of the Beatles' breakup that was put upon him, them sort of typing him as a lightweight, especially compared to the gravitas of a George Harrison with All Things Must Pass, or this gut-wrenching, emotional soul-bearing of a John Lennon with Plastic Ono Band. He almost comes off as flippant by comparison, coming out with Another Day. At the same time, they're coming out with this more serious, weighty stuff. The people that were crafting the rock narrative in Rolling Stone and Cream and Crawdaddy were saying is, no, Paul, this is not worthy of your Beatle legacy. We wish you'd get your shit together and do something worthy of that. And he wasn't taking that advice too seriously. He was doing what he had to do at the time he was doing it. And in terms of craftsmanship. I don't think you can fault him or think he was backsliding. Maybe it just wasn't what people were expecting from him.
I think that's right. And he's pretty upfront about saying that he deliberately tried to shift his career post-Beatles away from doing Beatlesque kind of stuff. And I remember living through all that, thinking at the time, McCartney was a really fine album. Ram, kind of lightweight. And then the first Wings album was just dreadful. And Red Rose Speedway, he was like, oh my God, what is he doing? He's destroying himself. And I remember when Band on the Run came out, there was no advanced publicity for that. I was a hardcore Beatle guy, and I was reading Rolling Stone and Cream and stuff, and there was no indication that he had this record coming out. And I walked into the record store, and there it was. I was, shit, okay, I'm going to buy this. I mean, the last couple have been pretty awful. And got it home, put it on, and was just blown away. It sounded fantastic. The songs were great. I remember calling up my brother, who's a couple years older than me, and my major influence in terms of music, and saying, Matt, you've got to hear this. Oh, my God, he just done a fantastic record. Now, of course, over the years, I've gone back and think very highly of Ram. I mean, that's just got some great songs and great melodies on it. And then the same with Red Rose Speedway, and I particularly like when the box set came out a couple of years ago with the double album version. I thought, this is great. Should have put that out. But it was kind of a deliberate thing on his part to not repeat himself. And you got to give him credit for that. Then you look back at John's career, as you said, the critics just fawned over his. But some of his stuff is really pretty mediocre in his solo career. When you look at Mind Games, he's kind of phoning it in. There's a lot of not great material. And then, my God, sometime in New York City, what was he thinking? That's just awful. And then I was really disappointed in Rock and Roll album, how terrible the arrangements were and just the whole thing. That should have been a killer album. And by putting all those saxophones and everything else on it, that just wasn't his style. It didn't suit him well at all. But then he bounces back with Walls and Bridges and then takes off for 5 years. So his stuff hasn't gotten that critical attention that Paul's did. Paul's had a much longer career. He's had some fantastic albums, and he's had some that are not so good. And one thing that I think is unfortunate for Paul is that if an album isn't commercially successful, he tends not to think well of it. And I think that's kind of a weakness on his part. And the one that I think he really doesn't pay any attention to is Press to Play. I think is a terrific album.
Did you think so when it came out?
Yeah, I liked it immediately because it was different. And, I mentioned in the review that there's nothing in there in the lyrics from that album and nothing with his collaboration with Eric Stewart. And I think they had a falling out a year or so after that, but so he probably downplays it. And the record got slammed by the critics and it wasn't very successful. But I thought it was a terrific record. I particularly liked Pretty Little Head and a few others. And I thought that for once the 12-inch remixes were really good. Usually 12-inchers were kind of lame, but those were pretty good. I mean, I liked Angry and Talk More Talk and Only Love Remains. All that. That was a great album, but never plays anything from it.
Do you think that album will get a revisionist view someday?
Well, I hope so. I hope he does one of his archive releases on it, and I'd like to hear that. And I think that would maybe generate a reconsideration of it. On the one hand, I understand people not liking the production on it, but I always liked Hugh Padgham, who worked with XTC. I thought what he did on that was good. He was trying to be a little more contemporary and a little different. And I thought that was fine. So I do hope he gets reconsideration.
You do raise a really good point about Paul's perceptions being shaped by record sales and what he views as success or failure, and therefore will either tout what he perceives as successful or ignore and shuffle to the side the stuff that he doesn't think much of simply because it either didn't sell or the critics had their knives out for it. He seems to be in that way sort of responsive to the narrative being crafted in the media about his work, so much so that there are times where he appears to not know what to do for his next move in the wake of, say, Broad Street, which really blew up in his face. So then he tries to go contemporary with Press to Play, and that doesn't do too well. Around that time, I think, was the Phil Ramone sessions. So he starts on that, and then they have a falling out, and it ends up not doing anything. And eventually he gets it together for Flowers in the Dirt, which is actually sort of crafted. It's almost like a tattoo of recordings that took place over different times and different sessions. And I thought that was an amazing album. I really loved it at the time it came out. And what a great thing to come back and tour on.
And of course, a big part of that is his collaboration with Elvis Costello, who is as close in of a mindset to Lennon as he has ever come to as a collaborator. And I'm a huge Elvis Costello fan.
Ticks all the right boxes, that Liverpool background, that acerbic wit, wordplay, a reputation of being a hard guy, but writing melodies and tunes as good as anybody, as commercial as anyone.
Exactly. His wordplay is just phenomenal. I just love his stuff.
And implicitly, you could see where Paul would value that as he writes in lyrics about his father being such a crossword puzzle freak, and that's something that made an impression on him at an early age.
Right, exactly. And again, I was disappointed that he didn't select anything from Flowers in the Dirt for lyrics. Maybe he didn't want to highlight other people's lyrics and stuff. I made a mistake in the review in saying that other than his work with Linda and John, there were no other collaborators, but he does have Say, Say, Say in there, Michael Jackson. I reread that write-up just the other day, and he seems to be suggesting that most of the lyrics to Say, Say, Say were by Michael, that his contribution was more on the music and arrangement of the things. So I thought that was curious that he chose to put that one in there, but nothing with Elvis or Eric Stewart.
And maybe because he values it more because it was a commercial hit.
It was a commercial hit, yeah.
But it is interesting that if that line of thinking that the exclusion may be because maybe it was Elvis that was doing the bulk of the lyric writing, if I were to go back to those songs, certain ones you can definitely see as having more of the fingerprints of Elvis's style on them lyrically than Paul's. My Brave Face, I would have thought would be more of a Paul thing with contributions from Elvis. But yeah, it would have been nice because the whole basis of these 2 volumes of lyrics is conversations with Muldoon. And so I would have loved to have heard everything he could draw out of them going into the creation of those songs.
Yeah, well, exactly. In My Brave Face, I agree with you. That very much sounds to me like a Paul. And I thought that was a terrific song when it came out. It should have been more of a hit. It reminded me of something else that occurred to me. When I'm reading this, there's a collaborator like Muldoon, and the way that they did it, where he took the transcripts and edited them, I wonder how much of Paul's voice is coming through in this. And I'm assuming that Paul did actually write the foreword. And I was thinking, comparing the voice of that is to the voice of these individual song write-ups. And I get a sense that Muldoon may have watered it down a little bit. I don't clearly hear Paul sometimes. There's some cliches in there. And again, I don't get that sense sometimes that Paul's really revealing his memories or his emotions and stuff, sentiments in some of these. And I just wonder how much of that is Muldoon's editing, or it's just that Paul didn't get into that kind of detail. Paul's been accused by people over the years of being very guarded and not revealing in interviews. You know, the interviewers will write, man, this was a great thing. I felt like it really got to the core. Then when they get done with it, they're looking it over, they realize, no, he really did a lot of stuff here. I didn't really get what I thought I was getting here. Paul is one of the most recognizable people in the world, and he has been for 60 some odd years. He's a very professional interviewee, I would say. And I suspect that this is all on purpose. And I was hoping that lyrics would get more underneath, more revealing. In a lot of ways it does, but I still sense he's holding back.
I got that sense too. And of course, the stereotype of Paul is he is a pro, like you say. He will deflect if it gets near anything he doesn't want to talk about. That said, going into this, I expected there'd be a lot more of that than there was. And I was sort of surprised some of the inherent anger he expresses toward John, even now, alongside the love. I think that might be the furthest he's gone publicly with that.
That's absolutely right. I'm glad you reminded me of that. Yeah. And this is the most I've ever heard him talk about Jane Asher.
Yes, and the pictures, too.
Yeah, the pictures were terrific. And again, you've got to read multiple song write-ups to get the flow of the Jane Asher stuff. I think it's in For No One, where he acknowledged that this is about our breakup. And he said, when you get right down to it, as much as I loved her and we had a good time, we just didn't match up. Now, he doesn't mention that he was cheating on her, but he said, when I met Linda, there was that matchup in all ways. So that was, the stuff with Lennon in particular, when he's talking about that September 69 meeting when John says, I'm leaving, and he says, you knocked me on the mat there, and it was hard getting up. But when he's talking about how do you sleep, and he said, all I did was yesterday. Really? Fuck you, John. Okay, now you really get to it, because in the past he would deflect off that and say, didn't really think much about it, didn't pay any attention. But he was damn hurt, and the hurt's still there 50 years later.
Absolutely. And that's the most vividly I've seen that come out of him. It's like what you've been wanting to hear from him. Come on, Paul, be real. It hurt me as a fan to listen to that, like listen to your parents fight.
At the time, yeah. And the other thing that I thought is interesting, you have to read several of these things to get it, because Paul doesn't really address it. But I've read interviews or critiques of Paul and stuff where they try to make it sound as though he and John really weren't that close, that John didn't care for him and stuff. And that's just complete bullshit. When you read these things, and he talks about the writing sessions that would go for 3 or 4 hours, and he said, whenever we went to write a song, we always completed a song. And it was just the two of them, eyeball to eyeball. There's so many things throughout there where he's mentioning this stuff. And then when you watch the Get Back documentary, there's several examples where all four of them are in the room, but it's John and Paul that are connecting when they're doing Two of Us. And they're just staring at each other. And, you're thinking the entire world is excluded from that. They show the shot of George sitting there just staring at him with that hangdog look on his face, the day that he quit. And you think back to your own childhood, your gang of friends when you're 14, 15, 16, really important. And there's all the different relationships in between that. And there might be two guys better friends than the rest of them, and all the tensions that creates kind of thing. And I got that sense of, in reading this and also watching Get Back at times, they were damn close. And they had that ability that close friends have to communicate without very many words. Watch Get Back, and this applies to all four of them, or you read the transcripts from the recordings. For outsiders, they're incredibly inarticulate. They speak in half sentences and and this and that. It drives you out of your mind reading that shit.
Yeah.
But they can communicate musically when Paul will say something like, oh, George, you need to go dum-dum-dum-dum instead, or do that funny thing. We're outsiders. We don't know what the hell he's talking about. Maybe a musician can pick up on it. I'm not. But it's kind of like, God, it's frustrating to listen or read along with those things. But boy, the connection was there, and you see it pretty clearly in Get Back.
Yeah, and nowhere is that more frustrating than even when you see the transcript of the flower pot conversation. This is like the biggest holy grail in all of the January 69 sessions of them sort of being real with each other, even though you watch the film and you think it's just John and Paul, but in fact, Yoko and Ringo and Linda are there. And Paul is not talking about what they've talked about outside of John and Yoko's presence, which is John and Yoko's relationship and the disruptive effect it has had on the group dynamic. Still, they're talking about these inner dissents going on with George and what's going on that's led to his walking out. They're digging up history, throwing up past examples of things, and they're feeling intimidated by Paul when he wants to force an arrangement on a song on them, that sort of thing. Well, you get that much out of it, but there's still so much in their use of language that clearly they're getting each other, but we as outsiders, it is just so sort of abstract, yet it's clear that they know what they're saying to each other. The other great thing about Get Back is that as Beatle fans have been reading this stuff for a million years, every book, every trope that's been handed to us about the Beatles' arc and how, as you said, they weren't really that close is one school of thought that's gone on about them, which is belied by what you see in Get Back at what's not even their best time by every account. Yet what you see there is better than what you were led to expect. The friendship and camaraderie is still intact. And yes, that being in the room, even if it's all four of them and whoever else is around them, the way John and Paul zero in on each other and are on this elevated level of communication creatively And personally, it's just an amazing thing to see. It's not clear from years of listening to the Niagaras. You need that visual to really put that out, and there it is.
I had been collecting the Get Back session bootlegs since the very beginning and listening to that stuff. And then when the Purple Chick set came out, listened to that maybe 3 times all the way through, and sitting there with Soapy's book and stuff. And you're right. It's really terrific to see the visuals that go along with some of that. But I have my problems with Get Back as well. You know, it's kind of like the pendulum swung back a little too far.
Overcorrection?
Yeah. Well, if you've read Doug Soapy's 2 newsletters so far, where he's looked at the first 2 parts, there's quite a tremendous amount of manipulation and distortion of what's going on there. I was really disappointed with Jackson afterward. If you read my review of the movie at the first issue of that, I was very, very praiseworthy stuff. And I copy edited the newsletter for Doug, and so he sent it to me after I'd already submitted my review of the movie. And I read his piece, and I wrote it back, and I said, Jesus, Doug, I feel like I should rewrite some of the review.
Way to ruin it for me.
And he said, let's put it out that way because it works that way. It's like, okay, here's somebody who's a longtime fan. This is what they thought. But then when you find out how much he changed things, and the thing that really irritated me was his intentional manipulation of our emotions there after George quits. And the 3 of them walk over to that one area with their arms around. And the impression is, they're so upset and they've got to get away from the cameras and everything, and the microphones, and talk about the impact of George leaving. When it turns out what they're really doing is making fun of Lindsay Hogg and his alleged homosexuality and stuff. They're just goofing off. Right. And they knew that there was a microphone there, and that's why they were standing there. It's like, come on. This is supposed to be a documentary. You're not supposed to be doing that kind of crap. And then in the second issue, he points out so many other things. He'll fly in the conversation and the musical part that doesn't belong with that. It was from later in the day and things like that. I don't mind, as he said in interviews and things, that there were times when there was no visual to go with audio, and so he had to do things. Okay, that's fine, but I think he's going a bit further than that. I'd like to have him address that sometime. And because now this presentation, Get Back, is going to be the official history. And Paul's even said, this is the way I want to remember it. But when looking in lyrics, he acknowledges that, let's see, I think he's talking about I've Got a Feeling, saying how great it was to have John contribute. But he said, these final 2 years of the Beatles was pretty tough on John. He'd had a lousy childhood and stuff, and then things were happening to him. And Paul says, and the band was going through a very difficult time. Now this thing is, oh no, they weren't breaking up. And look at how many times they're smiling and stuff. And the fact of the matter is, look, George quit, and he didn't do that because he was having too much fun. He was really depressed. And after all, they put these recordings on the shelf for over a year. And there's John's famous quote about this being the biggest pile of crap surely recorded ever. Yeah. And all the contemporary reports indicate that they were very unhappy. And I think if we'd have had this level of film from the White Album, it would have been just as bad, if not worse. Again, George Martin takes off for 2 weeks. Never done that before. Maybe he had to get away. Jeff Emmerich quits being the engineer. Ringo quits. I mean, this was, they were falling apart at this point. They weren't communicating well. And the amazing thing is that they agreed to get back together and do one more record. It's astonishing. So I'm kind of concerned that pendulum swung back way too far. Yes, it's good to correct the impression that Let It Be gave, that it was just miserable all the time. There is a lot of interesting stuff going on, and the friendship is still there, and the musical connection is still there. But it was very tense at times. And, the other thing, too, you mentioned it about the flower pot conversation, the aspect of the relationship between John and Yoko interfering and causing tension with Paul and the others. That's really excluded from Get Back. If you look at the Get Back book that came out with it, and it has a lot more of the transcripts in it, and I think that was Kevin Howlett that did that, there's quite a bit more of Yoko coming forward and giving her expression on what they're going to be doing. There's a whole thing about the live concert in the audience, and she's saying, go the empty seats and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not one of these people who hate Yoko. I'm fine. I've got all of her albums, fine there. And of course, she didn't break up the Beatles, but she was a factor. There's no denying the fact that her presence in the studio made the other three uncomfortable. But again, I think it goes to the dynamics of the band that they put up with it because she was John's woman at the time. And despite everything they always said throughout the Beatles' time, John was the leader of that band. And his state of mind and emotion set the tone for things in the studio. If you look at the chronology of each album, they usually started off doing John's songs, recording his songs and stuff. And they recognized the fact that he's the guy to put the band together, essentially. And so they tiptoed around his mood. So the introduction of Yoko in there, they had to put up with it because, as Paul says at one point, if I push it, he'll leave. And Paul doesn't get the credit that he deserves for trying to keep the band together. And he was the one that really wanted that to happen. He's the one that was most hurt by it breaking up. But from a fan's point of view, we got to say, geez, thanks for doing it, or we wouldn't have had Abbey Road.
Right. Ringo's just of late starting to acknowledge that.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that Paul got so slammed for was when he sued the other three to break up the partnership. But I think they all acknowledged afterwards that they was right, and thanks, because it saved their money. Freezing it so Alan Klein couldn't get a hold of it. That was the thing to do. I mean, if you guys are going to leave the band, then you're going to break up the partnership. Let's not be tied together legally. That was the smart thing to do. Klein they should have never gone near him. They should have listened to Jagger and the others. But Paul just has to acknowledge it was unreasonable to think that the other three would sign with his in-laws. That was just dumb, even though they were very smart.
Yeah, they did all right by him, as later years proved.
I was interested to see, too, that Paul still refers to John Eastman as his brother-in-law, so there's still a relationship there. He mentions it in one of the song write-ups. Forget which one, but I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, going back to the White Album and just how that would have been the first project post-Brian that demonstrated the destabilization that took place, not counting Magical Mystery Tour, because that was entered into as a film project, not as an album project. And exactly what you enumerate in terms of George Martin, Emmerich, Ringo all walking out, this shift in dynamics, John being extraordinarily destabilized, breaks up his marriage, takes up with this woman he'd kept at arm's length for a couple of years to that point, and the effect it had on the band. Something we can talk about that you talked about in your review in terms of the lyrics book and the apparent lack of a fact checker when he's spewing out his memories. There is something to be said for a memoir, and we've talked about it in the show with Aaron Weber. First-person accounts of things have a value, even if the person recalling them, their recollections are shaded by their own personal interests or, in fact, their own recall of things, which, when you have empirical evidence that runs counter, that's still the way they remember it. And you and I both have got memories of our lives that if somebody fact-checked them, go, oh, well, actually, this is how it happened and not the way you picture it in your head. So we're all human. I don't think there's anything necessarily disingenuous about that. But there are things in there that I think would have maybe benefited if somebody pointed out, well, actually, Paul, what you're thinking. For instance, talking about Fool on the Hill, and now his latest story is that it was inspired by the Maharishi. My recollection is him talking about that in front of Hunter Davies in early 1967, before they even knew who the Maharishi was. He'd gotten that concept already out there if he hadn't finished the song yet. There are things like that all over the place. And the song I Will, he cites in January 1969 as an example of something as part of the bigger discussion of Yoko's presence impacting the Lennon-McCartney partnership when they're trying to work through a song. And he talks about, suddenly I feel like I should be writing about white walls and things like that to please them rather than follow the partnership and the songcraft as it existed to this point, because her presence has that effect. And I'm wondering if somebody had been around during the creation of lyrics to sort of prompt him, well, Paul, actually, if that would have jarred different recollections or different perceptions of some of the songs he put in there.
Yeah, and thing with memoirs, and I read a lot of these kinds of things by music or other writers and stuff, a memoir is always going to be self-serving, no matter how honest you want to be with things, because of the very things you were mentioning, that memory just isn't there. I know in my own work, when I was working in government, I oversaw the research program for my agency, and one of the less important things we did, or the less interesting things we did, was fact checking. Whenever there was a speech or report put out, whatever, we did fact checking. And somebody would ask me on a research question, what's the prevalence of marijuana use among 12 to 17-year-olds? I would say, let me check the survey results. I don't want to answer at the top of my head because I get things wrong when I do that. So I don't want to have to go back and correct myself. So I always go back to the original source document if I can. And the same with our fact checking stuff. Well, memoirs don't often do that sort of thing. And another example, added to the ones you mentioned about Paul, I forget which song it is he's writing about, but he mentions that, in the U.S., they always change their albums, and up through Help, the albums were different, but after that. And I thought, well, no, Rubber Soul and Revolver were considerably different. Rubber Soul, particularly, that's a completely different feel to the whole album. It's not acoustic kind of album here, but in the UK, Drive My Car and some other stuff. Then Revolver dropped off 3 of John's songs in the U.S. that made it a completely different experience. So he doesn't remember those kinds of things, and there was no fact checking. I point out in the review that he's quoting lyrics from what he thinks is "You Never Give Me Your Money," but the quote is actually from the end. And so those kind of things, the MPL fact checker should have just corrected, but they didn't.
Yeah, there's a misreading of Band on the Run lyrics, which I thought was funny because that's a song he still performs.
Yeah, exactly. The Undertaker's not ringing the bell.
Right.
Exactly. And he gets defensive about that. The song called, I Was There.
Yes.
It's obviously a shot at all the biographers and stuff out there, which I can understand from his point of view, but his memory, anybody's, just isn't that specific. And so I always like going back to original sources, and I've been collecting Beatles books for decades here, and my favorites are reference books that have a lot of that information in them, and I discount most of the memoirs and biographies to a certain extent because of that sort of thing. There's been so many shoddy books written, but the reference ones that are pulling up original documentation, those are very interesting.
Yeah. And in the case of Paul, you could see where, like Ringo, he's claimed, I'm never going to write a memoir, but this was a perfectly valid way to get close to that, despite him already having done many years from now. And in between, you had Wingspan and also the 321 doc, which I don't know if you've seen that, but
yeah, I have.
Yeah, what your thoughts were on that. It just seems like, taken as a whole, I think he does recognize he's running out the clock. He recognizes that Lennon Remembers carried an awful lot of weight for a long, long time, and it went unanswered in its time. So perceptions hardened. Phil Norman certainly ran with that, and other writers as well. And once John was gone, he's been put in this unenviable position of having to defend himself and speak up for himself in the face of this martyr now on a pedestal. And there's no way not to come off as crass or self-serving, but it was absolutely something perfectly valid up to December 7th, 1980, that he left the field unoccupied, and now he's scrambling to make up that time in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, and I think he's referred to it once or twice, that it's hard for him to compete with the martyred Lennon, and that is an unfortunate thing for him. That will only get balanced in decades to come after all of us are gone. People will continue to assess, biographies that are written, and this is almost true in every case, are reflections of their time. That author is trying to place this person's life within a context of what's going on these days. And that's going to happen. It happens with the Beatles, and it'll continue to happen. So in the future, there will be biographies that look at this perhaps in a different way, in a more balanced way. And it's one of the things that's driving me nuts with Mark Lewis. He's taking so long to write these things because he keeps wanting to track down everything. So this book will be the most definitive version. Well, there is no such thing as a definitive version. Somebody 50 years from now is going to have more things to say, and he's going to have a different perspective to do it. So we'll continue to write these things. So, Mark, get over it right now.
Right. It's not going to be the last word.
Yeah. And I agree with you. You take these various things that Paul has done many years from now, and 321, the anthology stuff, and kind of piece this together as best you can. I thought that 321 was terrific. Again, really interesting.
What you got now?
Got this one.
The sea in the sky with diamonds. This is why we don't go into tapes.
It's beautiful.
And again, I was thinking that Rick Rubin was doing a somewhat similar approach to the Showa documentary, and that he was trying to bring up in his questions things to get Paul to think and reveal that he's never done before, by actually sitting there and playing the record, and him being a producer and musician, understanding the creative process, to ask him about bits and pieces and stuff. It was tremendous. I thought that was a terrific documentary, and I'd like to see an expanded version of it put out on Blu-ray or DVD. That was excellent. Well done.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a good choice getting somebody, just as they chose a poet with an Irish background to do lyrics. It was like some extraordinarily insightful decision-making going on to create these projects. It's something that it could have gone badly if they'd chosen the wrong person, but I think they did really well by that for sure. It's too bad that Get Back is what it is, and as we've discussed, and I think we'll discuss more, viewing it as a documentary implies a straight-up, honest, unflinching telling of things, whereas from what we know now, and I'm not in any way faulting Peter Jackson because I think he approached it as a filmmaker and as a fan. I don't think he saw himself as a historian per se, which would have made him adhere to another set of rules. I think that he sees himself as a storyteller, a filmmaker. He's worked that media for decades, and therefore he's going to make certain choices the way he did. I think awareness of it on the part of people like us who are interested in factual data, as long as we know that and don't take that as the last word, as long as we have a Doug Solpe to point out, well, this was actually what happened here, folks, we'll be well served. And that doesn't take away from my enjoyment of Get Back as a film any more than any of the other Beatle films. You know what you're seeing is not 100% real, but you can still enjoy what there is out of it that gives you pleasure, I guess.
Yeah, and I agree to a great extent with that. But my problem is the public perception of the film is as a documentary that is presenting the truth as it actually was. And there needs to be a corrective out there. I urge Doug to try to get his analysis more widely distributed than it has. You know, all the major news organizations around the world got onto this Get Back film, and the common perception is this is what really happened kind of thing. And outside of a couple hundred people that get his newsletter and stuff, nobody knows really the extent to which he manipulated the footage he had.
I absolutely get that this, in its form, as loved by millions of Beatle fans around the world, will stand and carry a certain amount of weight. And to me, it's sort of a corollary to the Jeff Emmerich book, which is so revered, so loved, and is so full of bad history.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear you say that.
It's a terrible book, and nobody wants to believe me or wants to agree with me, but you can enjoy it for the entertainment value, the same way we enjoyed Alan Williams' book, The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away, which had more laughs in it. But if you're taking it as a straight-up history by somebody who was there, that's the part I get sick of hearing from his apologists. Well, he was there. Yeah, but guess what? By 1970, he didn't remember anything. I
was so irritated with that book, I almost didn't finish it. I just talk about a self-serving memoir. My overall impression was this was Jeff Emmerich saying, you know, I didn't get the credit for the Beatles' success that I deserved. I put those microphones close to the drums. Which song did you write? Which song did you sing or play on? And his treatment of George Martin was astonishingly nasty. I couldn't believe how dismissive and critical of him was. at the same time acknowledging the man gave him a career. And I've never read anything about Martin that said he was anything other than a gentleman and a professional. The Beatles wouldn't be who they were today if George Martin hadn't been the producer.
You even get glimmers of that in the Get Back doc.
Yeah, and he was there more involved once they got to the Apple Studios than anybody has ever actually credited. It's all Glyn Johns. Well, they weren't recording anything for release when they were at Twickenham. That was just rehearsal. But when they got to the Apple, George was there. But I think he is so central to the Beatles' success in terms of his ear for what was a good song to record, to what the arrangement should be, and then his later string and orchestral arrangement. You compare that to a lot of the other British bands, their producers, Andrew Loog Oldham, he wasn't a real producer. He was a showman. Kit Lambert.
Yeah, Chris Stamp.
They were not producers. At least the Kinks had Shel Talmy, who was. But anyhow, I just thought that Emmerich's book was one of the worst of the Beatles Insider books that I've read. I was very annoyed with it.
A lot of score settling going on there. Whatever his beef was in George, it was spilled over every page.
God, yes. I mean, he didn't like Ringo, didn't like George, and didn't much care for John either. Yeah, that came through. I mean, his hostility to George was incredible. Now, on the other hand, you get through the history of the Beatles and the various people that were close to them, you don't get the impression that they were a very sentimental lot to people. They come and they go. And look at with Neil Aspinall. I was really kind of disappointed how they tossed him over so easily. I was like, we lost the final lawsuit with Apple Computers, and so you need to go kind of thing. They just don't seem to have that closeness with people that were central to their lives at times, or when people die and stuff.
Thinking of Mel Evans?
Yeah, and Mel's probably the evidence number one there. Boy, when the band broke up, there was a little bit of contact afterwards, but that band was everything to him. When you read those excerpts from his diaries that have come out, I mean, it's almost pathetic at times how devoted he is to them. That they just kind of discarded him and didn't have much to say when he was killed.
It's really sad, and I'm hopeful that there will be sort of a corrective, or at least made public an understanding of his value to them with the upcoming Womack book, using his diaries and telling his story on a big scale for the first time.
Yeah, I hope Womack stops referring to them as bandmates. I don't know if you read his 2-part George Martin biography, which I liked quite a bit, but my God, other words, call them the Beatles, the group, the band, the Fab Four, but constantly the bandmates this, the bandmates that. That drove me nuts. I kept thinking your editor should have jumped on that. The 2-part Martin biography was quite good.
Yeah, that's a story that hadn't really been told as properly. And again, giving credit to him that might have been diminished with the Emmerich book. And certainly for the publishing that Martin did do, starting with All You Need Is Ears, he didn't really deliver that satisfying insider account that everybody was clamoring for. And I think it was because he was too honest. And if he didn't remember, he wasn't going to do it.
Right. And I think that's true. And he was always somewhat self-effacing, didn't want to take credit for stuff. And there's people that I've read that don't consider him a very good producer. But the thing about Martin was you can't think of him solely as a modern day aspect of a producer. He was the A&R guy, and he was there to help pick out songs, and he got the arrangements, but he wasn't the guy who was setting the levels and coming up with a whole approach to how the album should be done kind of thing. He was there to really nourish these guys. And when you look at their very first session there in June 62 and reading Emmerich's book or others, how inexperienced and provincial they were. They came in with crappy equipment, didn't know what the studio to do with it, stuff that the technicians were all laughing at them behind their back. And Ron Richards is in charge of the session, but he brings George Martin in there. And I think it's Womack's book, but also they describe Martin basically reading the riot act on how bad they are for like 20 minutes. And Martin's kind of thinking, well, when are they going to push back on me? But they just listen to it until George does his I don't like your tie routine. But that Martin was able to see something there and pull it out of them as they went along. His rearrangement of the opening to Please, Please Me and stuff. There's also the song selection. This is the other thing about the Beatles that always struck me. They were very efficient in the studio. There aren't very many songs that they held back because they didn't care for them. 7 or 8 of them, and they were rightly held back. You Got Troubles and stuff like that. But Martin would listen to them and say yes or no. We're going to work that stuff up. And to me, he was just so instrumental, particularly in the early years. But then his arrangements, that's the other thing. You look at a song like Yesterday with the string quartet on it, and you compare that to what other producers, and I always think of Phil Spector, with these massed orchestras and strings, the violins and stuff on that. So much different than what Martin did. Very tastefully strained arrangements on Eleanor Rigby's another great example. But everything he did, and even compare his arrangements to Mike Leander's on She's Leaving Home. His arrangement is so different from what Martin would have done. And I always thought that kind of weakened that song as good as it is.
Thank you. I've always felt that even before I knew the backstory, when my young ears were hearing that album for the first time, I thought, God, this is so syrupy. There's a great song here, but it's almost like we are going to beat you over the head with this harp arrangement because we want you to cry real tears. We want you to feel for this. I thought it was a little heavy-handed. And then when I found out, George Martin didn't arrange it. Oh, that's why.
That's right. You would never describe George Martin arrangement as syrupy. He was the antithesis of that.
It's timeless, and that's why that stuff stands out. I think to myself, what if Mickey Most was producing him? Well, his criteria was the hit record.
Yeah, give me a pop hit record. And see, the other thing, too, Martin being classically trained, but then he also knew all the top players in the classical world. He could reach out to, was it Alan Civil for the trumpet?
Dave Mason.
Yeah, just incredible. There was nobody out working then that I could think of that done that sort of thing and had those connections in that respect. The main reason I thought Everett's book was awful, but then his treatment of George, Ringo, and others.
Yeah, while putting Paul on the pedestal as the one guy that worked with him after the Beatles.
Yep. He was the best man at my wedding.
Yeah. Yeah, he probably in truth was.
His work was really good. As an engineer on that, and then his production for Imperial Bedroom by Costello, I thought was superb. So I don't have any problem with the work he did. It's just the attitude he had. And I think you really hit the nail on the head. And it's my revenge book here. It's about the wars and show how important I was.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by the Corgis.